In this session, we're going to be talking about the periods of the Exodus, Israel's worship, and tribal Israel. So if you're ready, let's begin. First, what are we going to try to accomplish in this module? We've already covered the periods of origins and patriarchs. You'll remember that the period of origins records 4 major events in Genesis 1 through 11. Creation, the fall of the human race, the corruption of the early human civilization, and their judgment through the flood. We also covered the second rebellion of the human race at the Tower of Babel. Beginning in Genesis 12, we looked at the lives of the 4 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Jacob had 12 sons and a daughter, but the principal son among them was Joseph, who was a type of Christ in that he saved his people during the famine by relocating them to Egypt. Now, we've already covered Genesis, so at this point, I think it's in order to give a big picture view of the entire Torah. Remember that the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy. We will cover the last 4 of these books in the period of the Exodus. As I said before, the scholars have a special term for these books of Torah. They call them the Pentateuch, which means 5 books in Greek. Others refer to them more casually as the Law or the Law of Moses. Let's take each one of them in turn. The book of Genesis is the book of beginnings, and indeed the word Genesis does mean how things began or how they were generated. The book of Exodus recounts Israel's deliverance from Egyptian slavery. Leviticus deals with priestly codes, rituals, and sacrifices, that sort of thing, and it provides detailed instructions for the worship system of ancient Israel, which we'll cover later on in this module. The book of Numbers describes the wilderness wanderings of Israel between the Exodus and their conquest of Canaan. Due to their lack of faith, they were condemned to wander in the desert for 40 years until that adult generation died off. Deuteronomy is a second giving of the law. In fact, in Greek, Deuteronomy means second law. The book is actually a second giving of the law to the generation who were children or very young or maybe even born during that time in the wilderness. This second giving of the law not only made it personal to this younger generation, but it also came with some explanations that were not given to the older generation some years before at Mount Sinai. All right, let's look at the period of the Exodus. If you follow the chronology of the Bible itself, the time period would take place sometime in the 1400s BC. Some scholars and archaeologists would, of course, disagree with that. They would place the time more in the range of the 1200s BC, and of course there are technical reasons why they do that, but I think it's safest to stay with the Bible's own reckoning of the years. For example, in the book of 1 Kings chapter 6, it explicitly tells us that the Exodus occurred 480 years before Solomon began construction of the temple. So when did Solomon begin construction of the temple? Well, sometime around 960 BC, or maybe just a bit earlier than that. So that would put the Exodus somewhere around the year 1450 BC, by the Bible's own reckoning. Let's set Solomon's reign at 960 BC. It's probably not exact, but it's close enough. 1 Kings 6 says the Exodus happened around 480 years before that. So 960 BC plus 480 equals 1440 BC. You see how that works? Let's summarize the major events of the Exodus. At the end of Genesis, Joseph had moved his extended family to Egypt, where they lived under his protection. In Egypt, Israel prospered for several generations. They did really well. But then there was a regime change, and the Egyptians began to fear and hate Israel because of their rapid population growth. Some other ancient sources, like the book of Jasher, suggest that there had been an invasion of Egypt, that the Israelites had rallied to help the Egyptians repel this invasion. But their military success had really scared the Egyptians, and that caused the oppression. Made them think, oh my goodness, if they could defeat our enemies, then they probably could definitely defeat us. And so this caused the oppression of Israel. I don't know that that's true. It's not what the Bible necessarily says. The book of Jasher may be giving us some extra details. The Israelites did have rapid population growth, and that's what the Bible tells us. So the Egyptians enslaved and treated the Israelites with great cruelty. By the time of Moses' birth, Israel was in a real predicament. The Pharaoh, and that's the king of Egypt's title, had decided that the way to deal with the Israelite threat was to kill the baby boys as they were born. They could grow up to be soldiers, in other words. So sadly, untold numbers of little boys were killed, many of them by throwing them into the river. So when he was born, Moses' mother saw that he was an unusual child. So she came up with a plan. She actually ended up obeying the Pharaoh's decree. She put him in the river. There was a watertight basket that kept him afloat, and she put him in at a place where the Pharaoh's daughter was known to bathe. Pharaoh's daughter did discover the baby boy there, and she was so entranced with him that she took him into her house to raise him as an Egyptian. But she couldn't nurse him, so she hired Jochebed, Moses' mother, to nurse him for her. Because of her early influence, Moses never forgot that he was an Israelite. So when he reached an age of maturity, he realized that he might be that promised one that Israel had been looking for several generations, the deliverer who would save them from Egypt. When Moses saw an Egyptian mistreating an Israelite, he became angry and he killed that Egyptian. But the authorities found out and he had to flee for his life over into Saudi Arabia where the Midianites lived, and there he spent 40 years. At the end of that time, Moses encountered God in a bush that was burning but never somehow got burnt up. He was so intrigued by this sight that Moses approached the bush. And from there, God spoke to him, revealing his personal name, Yahweh, Hebrew for I am that I am, the eternal, self-existent one. Here's what that sacred name looks like in Hebrew. It's so sacred that even today many Jews will not dare to say it for fear of taking it in vain. Instead, they just say the Lord or just the name. In English Bibles, when you see God referred to as Lord in all caps, that's where the sacred name is used in the original Hebrew. When Lord is written capital L small O-R-D, that's when the Hebrew word Adonai is used as a substitute for the name. I have taught at the college level for a number of years, and one of the things I've noticed is I've had Jewish students in my class, and that is when it comes to writing the word God, G-O-D, most, if not all, of my Jewish students refused to write the whole word. They would write G space D or G underscore D, but never the whole term. And that's because they were afraid that they might be taking God's name in vain. Okay, so God told Moses to go back to Egypt and lead Israel into the land promised them through their ancestor Abraham. So Moses, along with his brother Aaron, confronted Pharaoh with God's command. The command was, "Let my people go." Each time Pharaoh hardened his heart against letting Israel go, and God sent a plague on Egypt. The Nile turned into blood. There were frogs, gnats, boils upon the animals and people, hail, etc. All told, there were 10 plagues, ending with the death of the firstborn male of every family. In order to prevent the Israelites from suffering the judgment on the firstborn males, God had commanded Israel to sacrifice a male lamb in place of their firstborn sons. The lamb was to be eaten by the family and its blood spread over the doorposts of each Israelite house. Doing that prevented Israel from suffering the same judgment as the Egyptians. Remember that it was not just the Egyptians who were sinful and rebellious. Israel had a sin problem as well, so they needed that covering. Throughout the rest of the Bible, a substitutionary sacrifice of blood will be at the very heart of reconciliation with God. And so Israel was preserved from the death angel who passed over their dwellings. And this is where the term Passover comes from. The annual Jewish feast of Passover commemorates this very event. Egypt was left in ruins. Its economy and its political system were thoroughly judged. Its gods were shown to be false because they could not stop the judgment of the true God. So in this dramatic way, God showed himself to be supreme over all the powers and kingdoms on earth. Remember that he's working to redeem the scattered nations that departed at the Tower of Babel and bring them back to himself through Israel. If you look carefully at Egyptian history, there is some evidence that for at least a generation or so after the Exodus, the Egyptians turned away from their gods and worshiped the God of creation. It didn't last very long, but apparently they did get the message, at least for a while. Israel then escaped, taking much of Egypt's wealth with them. If Israel was going to become a nation, of course, they needed seed money to start with, and that's how they started it. They journeyed through the desert until they came to the Red Sea, in Hebrew, Yam Suf. But Pharaoh was having second thoughts about letting the Israelites go. He pursued Israel with his army and trapped them on the shores of the Red Sea. God then supernaturally protected Israel with a pillar of fire, and God told Moses to stretch his staff over the water. The waters parted, and Israel walked through the sea on dry ground between the waters. When the Egyptian army tried to pursue them, of course, the walls of water collapsed, and they were all drowned. So now Egypt is not only destroyed at home, but they've lost their army and are very much vulnerable to attack. In the next weeks, Israel marched all the way to Mount Sinai. When they arrived at the mountain's base, they prepared to receive the law of God and become a mighty nation under God's covenant. What's a covenant? Well, the Bible word for covenant is barit, meaning solemn agreement between God and a group of people. Under a covenant, God promises to bless, protect, and work through the people, and the people promise to obey and serve and worship God alone. On a side note, the Bible says that when Israel left Egypt, they went out as a mixed multitude. That means that other people accompanied them who were not necessarily affiliated with any of the Israelite tribes. This may have included disillusioned Egyptians, as well as other kinds of people who were also slaves of the Egyptians. And I think that this little detail is important for a couple of reasons. First, because it reminds us that God is concerned with the redemption of the whole human race. It also shows us that non-Israelite people could be incorporated relatively easily into the covenant of Israel. When we get to the New Testament, we will find that God will blend Jews and Gentiles into the new covenant as a new people, the church. I won't get into a lengthy discussion about the route of Israel's exodus from Egypt. On the map, the orange line indicates what some scholars think is a possible route that Israel took on their escape. Down at the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula is a mountain called Mount Sinai. Saint Helena, the mother of the Emperor Constantine, identified this mountain as Mount Sinai in the 300s AD. After her son became emperor, Helena, who was a devout Christian, embarked on a religious pilgrimage to the Middle East, and through visions, she claimed to identify many sites associated with Bible events. However, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that actually links that particular mountain with the Exodus. I've marked out an alternative route with white arrows that seems to be a better fit for the Exodus account. That route crosses the Gulf of Aqaba arm of the Red Sea at its shallowest spot and leads to a mountain in northwest Saudi Arabia known by the Arabs as Jabal al-Lawz. According to Arab tradition, this is the actual Mount Sinai. And there are many fascinating things about this mountain, one of which is that it's the only one in the region that has its top blackened by some sort of intense heat, almost like an atomic blast melted the rocks on its peak. Exodus 19 verse 18 describes the scene like this: Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. Could the actual mountain of Moses be in what is now northwest Saudi Arabia? Well, in Galatians 4:25, the Apostle Paul tells us that Mount Sinai is in Arabia, not in the Sinai Peninsula. The Bible tells us that the Israelites escaped out of Egypt. Egyptian records seem to indicate that the Sinai Peninsula was considered the eastern outpost of Egypt at the time. Also, there are no artifacts or other evidence of a multitude of people encamped around this mountain in ancient times, as one would expect. The mountain in Saudi Arabia does have quite a bit of evidence of people staying there in ancient times. And that includes images of sacred cows on rocks, think the golden calf. It includes altars and a rock split in two with signs of huge water erosion at its base. I'm not saying it's true, I'm just saying it's something to think about. All right, Israel arrived at the base of Mount Sinai about 50 days after they left Egypt. The current Feast of Pentecost, which both Jews and Christians celebrate, takes place precisely at 50 days after the Feast of Passover. It commemorates the arrival of Israel at the mountain and the receiving of the law through Moses. The law includes the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, but also many others for a total of 613 commandments. These commandments are recorded in the books of Torah, and they center around honoring God above all else. They address core moral issues, as well as other restrictions such as not mixing the kinds of fabric woven into a garment, the kinds of food that can be eaten, whom you can marry, and regulations for priests and for proper worship. You can see copies of the Torah in scroll form still today in use in readings in Jewish synagogues. And by the way, although it's true that as far as anyone knows, no original manuscripts of the Torah or any other Old Testament books still exist, these documents have been copied with incredible accuracy. How do we know? Because of the 1947 discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These ancient manuscripts date from about 200 BC to around 100 AD, and they show that Jewish scribes were meticulous in their accuracy. To summarize this period of the Exodus, Israel was forged into a nation under covenant with God. During the Exodus, they were again set apart as the people of God by the rite of circumcision. Every male 8 days old was to be circumcised. That means that the foreskin of the penis is removed as a mark in their bodies to identify them as God's people. They were commanded to keep the Sabbath as a special day of worship and rest. Sabbath, or Shabbat, begins at sundown on Friday and ends at sundown on Saturday. The Israelites were also commanded to observe several sacred feasts and days of remembrance, such as Passover, Pentecost, Yom Kippur, and Tabernacles. The tribe of Levi led Israel in their worship. The priests, or Kohanim, oversaw Israel's purification through the blood sacrifice of certain accepted animals, bulls, goats, sheep, and so forth. A special movable sanctuary called the Tabernacle was built for that purpose. And we'll dive into the details of Israel's worship in the next lesson. There has been a lot of puzzlement, confusion, difficulty in just wrapping our heads around this sacrificial system among Christians today and even really throughout church history. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and hopefully we'll get a better understanding. Now, before we look at the details of Israel's worship, we need to remember that during this period, the tribe of Levi, or Levi, was set aside for God's service. In effect, they formed the clergy and provided the social services of Israel. They performed religious duties at the tabernacle and later at the temple, a permanent temple in Jerusalem built by Solomon. When the land was conquered, the Levites received no tribal territory, but they were scattered throughout the other tribes. So in effect, the Levites were in a class of their own. Remember that the two sons of Joseph were then elevated to tribal status themselves. So instead of the one tribe of Joseph, there are the tribes of his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. So when they settled the land, there were still 12 tribal territories, but with the Levites as a 13th special tribal group scattered throughout all the tribes. And this made it possible for them to fulfill their role of teaching the people of Israel about God and how to live for Him. While the entire tribe of Levi was devoted to religious matters, it was the specific family of Aaron, Moses' brother, who served as the priests, or Kohanim. Jews today still have Levites and Kohens among them, as shown in certain surnames, Levitz, Levi, Cohen, Cohen, etc. From Mount Sinai, Israel traveled north to a place called Kadesh Barnea, where they were poised to enter the Promised Land. From there, they sent out 12 spies, one from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. These spies spied out the land, and the spies returned, saying that the land was rich and inviting, but also full of evil people with strong cities. They were especially alarmed at the fearsome giants that they saw in certain places. At that news, Israel's faith failed. Out of the 12 spies, 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, tried to encourage Israel's faith, saying, "Yes, All that's true, but don't forget that God delivered us out of Egypt with many miracles. He can give us the land despite the strength and size of our enemies. But the bulk of Israel gave in to fear, and they chose not to enter the promised land. In a sense, they were opting to return to Egypt and resume slavery rather than trust God and face the dangers of conquering Canaan. Because of their unbelief, God condemned that generation to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Only after the adult generation died off could the younger generation conquer Canaan and inherit the promises. But God was faithful. During those 40 years in the wilderness, Israel's clothing did not wear out, and they received that daily gift of the miraculous bread called manna, which in Hebrew means, "What is it?" I guess they had no word for it because no one had ever seen it before. During this time, many other events took place. While Moses was on the mountain receiving the law, they reverted to idolatry and worshipped a calf idol. Later, they were tempted into debauchery and idol worship again through the false prophet Balaam. They also survived an attack by the Amalekites. But for the most part, they just were marking time until the faithless generation died. When they were all gone, the younger generation were given a chance to embrace the covenant once again. This restating of the law with some explanations is recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. Israel then proceeded to conquer the lands to the east of the Jordan River in the present countries of Jordan and Syria. At that time, Moses died and was succeeded by his lieutenant, Joshua. Under Joshua, Israel prepared to cross over to the west side of the River Jordan and take the main part of the land of Canaan. Okay, we'll move on to talk about Israel's entrance into the Promised Land in the next lesson. But for now, let's focus on Israel's worship. Here's a diagram of the tabernacle. Now you're looking down on it from directly above it as if you were a drone hovering over it or a bird flying over it. Let me explain the individual elements and how they worked. During their 40 years in the wilderness, God directed Israel to build a movable sanctuary called the tabernacle. The tabernacle was made mostly of fabric supported by a wooden frame. Its furniture and some of its implements were made of wood overlaid with gold. Others were just made of pure gold. The tabernacle itself was surrounded by a courtyard also made of fabric on wooden posts that could be put up and taken down as Israel moved around. What was the purpose of the tabernacle? Well, remember that Israel was given the commandments at Mount Sinai. 613 specific commands, from remembering to keep God first in their worship and devotion, down to very specific things about how to live daily life. So let's say that you are an Israelite and you had sinned by breaking the covenant in a way that was not openly and publicly defiant of God's law. You would need then to make atonement through offerings and sacrifices. For example, let's say that you violated the Sabbath by continuing to work after sundown on Friday. Let's say that after you did that, you also got drunk and beat your wife because she got on your case for Sabbath breaking. Today, most people wouldn't think too much about violating the Sabbath. Drunkenness is a bit worse for us, but still not considered the end of the world. But beating your wife, that's a very serious thing with us today. But in ancient Israel, under the covenant, all of these things would together be classified as what some translations call unintentional sin. Unintentional really isn't a great translation, though. What the Hebrew really seems to mean is that when you did the kinds of things where your actions were not public, they were not premeditated, they were not done as a defiant rebellion against God, and they were not part of a continuous pattern of negative behavior, that was classified as, quote, unintentional. Certain sins were more serious than others. Some translations call these sins intentional sins, while other translations translate them as high-handed sins. Those kinds of sins were public, were openly defiant of the covenant, were unrepentant and part of a pattern of behavior. Those high-handed sins, they were dealt with either through stoning to death or through being cut off and banished from the people of Israel. Disowned, in other words. Premeditated murder, open and continuous defiance of authority, even some forms of sexual sin, those were in this kind of category. So let's say that you'd committed an unintentional sin. For that, you had to make atonement in order to be restored into proper relationship with God and His people. To do that, you would take your offering to the entrance of the tabernacle. You might take a bull, a sheep, a goat, a dove, a pigeon, depending upon the type of sin that you were talking about. You would arrive at the entrance to the fabric fence that enclosed the compound. A Levite on duty would meet you to examine the animal that you brought as a sacrifice. It could have no defects. Once its fitness was confirmed, the Levite would call for the priest or Kohen on duty, who would direct you to place your hands upon the animal. This would ceremonially transfer your transgression to the animal. Then with a single knife stroke, the priest would cut the animal's neck. In the case of a bull or sheep, both of the animal's carotid arteries. The animal would quickly bleed to death, mercifully so. Then the Levites would take the body away and they would butcher it. Certain portions would be offered as a ceremonial remembrance before the Lord as a burnt offering on the altar. The Levites would keep a portion as their pay, so to speak. In the diagram, I'll move from right to left. The blood and entrails would be burned upon the bronze altar that you see as a large rectangle in the diagram. The priests and Levites would get a certain portion of the meat for themselves because, as I said, they were not allowed to make any other kind of living. They survived on offerings and on the sale of meat from sacrifice. You would be given back the balance of the meat as a celebratory meal, recognizing that your sin was now forgiven and dealt with. You are restored with God and God's people. The round object to the left of the altar was a large, in fact huge, metal basin. It was needed for washing because, let's face it, animal sacrifice is a messy business. The large rectangular object to the left of that is the actual tent of meeting where the priests met with God. The right half of the rectangle is called the holy place. There were 3 objects set up in the holy place. First was the table of showbread on which 12 fresh loaves of bread were placed each day in remembrance of the way that God had provided manna to the tribes of Israel in the wilderness. In the center was the altar of incense to represent the continuous prayers of God's people. And then there was the menorah, or 7-branched candlestick, or lampstand, which burned day and night. It represented the light of God among the Israelites and through them to the darkened world. If you will go to a synagogue or you see anything related to Judaism today, sometimes it's that menorah that acts as a symbol for the entire Jewish religion. The furnishings inside of the tabernacle were overlaid with gold. To the far left was the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies, separated from the holy place by a thick curtain or veil. In it was a single object, the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was a rectangular box about 3 1/2 feet long by about 2 1/4 feet wide and 2 1/4 feet deep. The metric measurements would be something like a bit over 1 meter long by around 3/4 of a meter wide and deep. The box was made of acacia wood overlaid with gold. Its golden lid held the images of 2 angelic beings called cherubim with their wings touching. Inside the box were 3 items: a jar of manna, the tablets of the 10 Commandments, and Aaron's rod of authority. Besides the individual sacrifices and offerings made by the people year-round, there was a special sacrifice during the time of Yom Kippur in the early autumn. At that time, the high priest would make an annual sacrifice for the entire nation, and then he would go behind the curtain into the Holy of Holies, where he would sprinkle the blood of sacrifice on the Ark of the Covenant to cover all of the unintentional sins of Israel that year. There were also other kinds of offerings, such as thank offerings for some blessing in your life, offerings made as a pure expression of love for God, and required offerings as tithes to support the priests and Levites and to care for the poor and maintain the tabernacle. All of these expensive sacrifices and offerings showed that sin is serious and costly. It requires the shedding of blood. They also reminded Israel and us that everything we have comes from God and ultimately belongs to Him. There is an event among a number of significant events during Israel's time in the wilderness that I want to discuss briefly. It has to do with a passage that I have puzzled over for quite a while. Numbers 21 records Israel's rebellion against Moses and against God, for which they were judged by sending poisonous snakes among them. Now, this was toward the end of the 40 years in the wilderness, and the people were understandably tired and worn out. They were facing the challenging task of now conquering the people in the land that God had promised them. But instead of persevering, they gave in to griping and dissension. And so many died from snake bite. The main poisonous snake or serpent in the area is the Palestinian viper. As a matter of fact, on one of my visits to Israel, I actually saw one of these poisonous snakes in the ruins of the ancient synagogue in Capernaum. And there were a lot of people around, so I knew it was a dangerous situation. But it reminded me of the time in Matthew 12, verse 34, when Jesus described the Jewish religious leaders of his particular day as a brood of vipers. Well, I quickly found a caretaker on the grounds, and he set off with a shovel to deal with the little problem. Anyway, in verse 8 of Numbers 21, God tells Moses, "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." And that's always bothered me. And yet Jesus refers to that very incident as a foreshadowing of his own death. The bronze serpent that Moses hung on the pole for people to look at and be healed has always been a cause of puzzlement to me. Jesus was hung on a cross for people to look at in faith and find eternal life. So its immediate meaning in the book of Numbers is that people could be healed of their snake bite by looking at that bronze serpent on a pole. And of course, it does prefigure our receiving of eternal life through faith in Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. So far, so good. But why a serpent? I mean, serpents generally symbolize Satan or something evil. So for a long time, it didn't make much sense to me. Well, after much thought and prayer and research, I've come up with this explanation. For what it's worth, I believe the Israelites were cured not by the serpent. Serpents were the cause of their death. What the serpent on the pole symbolized was the death of the serpent, the death of the very thing that caused their death. So they were saved by looking at the serpent and accepting the death of that thing that was destroying them. Likewise, we are saved from eternal death by faith in the thing that was destroying us. Jesus died on the cross to defeat death itself. Death died, and now we can live. So that's my explanation for that very puzzling passage in Numbers.